Morning, everyone. Just giving it a few seconds for people to connect. You can see the waiting room. There's still some people, but I think we'll start. Sorry for starting a few minutes late. We just had some technical issues we had to deal with. So welcome to this dialogue. My name is Ineke Stemmet. I'm the operations manager at SALO, and I just want to give a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to do a few house rules. This is a public dialogue and it is being recorded and it will be transcribed. And it will also be live streaming on Facebook. So please just be aware of that. Today we'll have a few panelists giving some input, and then we will open the room for a Q&A session. Please write any questions you have in the chat during the panel discussion if you want to. Otherwise, you can come in, you can just put your hand up using the hand function on Zoom. Come in during the Q&A, ask some questions, and engage with the discussion. Yeah, I think that's all from my side. Also, just to keep yourself muted, please, during the rest of the discussions. And then I just want to also thank our development partner, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, for making these kinds of dialogues possible. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Tawanda Sachikunye, who's going to be chairing this dialogue class. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ineke. Thank you for those great welcoming remarks. I'd like to second your greeting. Good morning to everyone. And since we're in December, I wish you all a happy festive season as well. So thank you for making time, even though I know that this is a very busy month. We've got an interesting and engaging topic today for our dialogue, and we've got a great panel to help us unpack issues and probably canvass potential recommendations. I must say that we're very privileged today as we celebrate 30 years of South Africa's democracy. All of our panelists today have helped make South Africa since '94 a better place. They've consistently promoted the public good for most of their lives. And so for me, it's a great honor to really chair this panel with such people who have really devoted a lot of their adult life to public service and to South Africa's well-being. So thank you so much for making time to join us. And it's a great honor for me to chair. I'd also like to observe all protocols for all distinguished guests who might join us today, and welcome everyone who's here with us. All right, my name is Dr. Tawanda Sachikunye, and I'm SALO's research associate. I work primarily on SALO's G20 program. Our topic today focuses on what is known as the Compact with Africa, or the CWA as an abbreviation. But we'll also talk about the African position and approach to the G20. The Compact with Africa is a G20 initiative introduced and initiated by the German government during its 2017 G20 presidency. It was initiated in collaboration with the African Development Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank Group. The core focus of the Compact with Africa is to boost private investment to and within Africa in relation to two key aspects: foreign direct investment, FDI, and the enhancement of domestic capital markets. The Compact focuses on capacity building and technical assistance in terms of initiating economic reforms, which stimulate greater private investment within Africa. The Compact with Africa is a voluntary G20 initiative, as African countries choose to sign up or to participate. So far, only 12 African countries have formally signed up. These include Egypt, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Senegal. But no other countries thus far have signed up for the Compact with Africa, although Zambia has shown interest. The Compact is largely focused on policy aspects relating to four key aspects. The first is macroeconomic policy reform. The second is debt sustainability. The third is standardization and uniformity of economic and finance systems. The fourth is domestic revenue mobilization. This is to ensure that our Compact with Africa members can optimize on the financial resources that they're able to source locally. And then lastly, the fifth one is lowering or reducing investment risk. So these five policy aspects, commentators have kind of critiqued them and say that they're largely orthodox reform measures. Okay, so some people argue that there's nothing really new about the Compact with Africa. This is a kind of repackaging of general orthodox liberalization measures. And that is quite an interesting critique. However, recent and tentative research from Flourier and Vertier, these are French scholars, indicates that the 12 countries that have signed up to the Compact with Africa, in terms of adopting particular reforms, such as the ones I've just mentioned, appear to have done better than their African counterparts. So it appears, this is economically, so it appears as though there may be some kind of link between the reforms put forward by the Compact and improved economic performance by particular African countries. But perhaps we should be cautious and await findings and conclusions of African policymakers, because this research has been done largely by, I think it was funded by the Bank of France and very good French scholars, but I think we should also have a perspective from the continent. So let's also await what the verdict is from our policymakers and experts, some of whom we have today on our panel. Mr. Silvio Ricozzo from Rosa Luxemburg, who have funded this dialogue, provided an excellent critique of the Compact in an earlier SALO dialogue a few months ago. One of the key limitations of the Compact is that it does not directly address the issue of human capital development. Noting that Africa's greatest resource is not its minerals or its commodities, but rather its young population, we have to invest, therefore, in our young people in order to safeguard the future of the continent. So the Compact with Africa, yes, it does focus on private investment, which is good, and things like debt sustainability, macroeconomic stability, how African countries can source financial resources locally. But what about the issue that is, the key aspect for Africa, which is human capital, how to develop the most important assets that we have as a continent and safeguard our future. Also, the increasing importance of things like factors such as climate, the green economy, and green industrialization are also aspects that need greater focus in terms of the Compact with Africa. Particularly when we observe that increasingly foreign direct investment inflows in Africa are beginning to be oriented towards climate-related or green sectors, including green hydrogen, wind and solar, electric vehicles. Therefore, billions of US dollars are being invested in these sectors, as noted by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So also to be quite prescient and ideal for the Compact with Africa to also start focusing on climate aspects and things such as the green economy. So we have to factor in the just transition and climate concerns when we review the Compact with Africa. Thankfully, we have a renowned climate expert with us on our panel to help us unpack this. Furthermore, we'll have to figure out how we infuse the G20 initiatives such as the Compact with Africa with African ideals, African values, and strategic insights sourced from us, the Africans ourselves. So our dialogue today will also focus on what Africa will most likely contribute to the G20 framework and processes, especially in a context where Africa, through South Africa, hosts the G20 for the first time. So these are exciting times for us in that the G20 is taking part on our beloved continent. So we're very fortunate to have, two panelists and experts who are Madam Ramafoko and Ambassador Mpashlwa to speak to these issues pertaining to the African approach to the G20. Madam Ramafoko was recently in Brazil, which is the recent G20 chair before passing it on to South Africa now. And Ambassador Mpashlwa was a former G20 Sherpa in 2010. Now, I know you're tired of hearing me. Now I'll try to just conclude my introductory comments very quickly. Now, I just want us to have some visuals up. Lily, could you help me with that? And what these visuals are trying to show is that Africa is having a difficult time integrating into the global economy. And this is why initiatives such as the Compact with Africa are very important, but also why the G20 is a very important forum, not only for South Africa, but for the African Union and other countries. Because through the G20, maybe, it's African policymakers, African civil society can think of how to improve Africa's participation in the global economy. Now, Africa's share, as noted by the United Economic Commission for Africa, Africa's share of global trade is at less than 3%. Okay, so in 2012, as this graphic shows, the share of Africa's, share of world exports was just below 4%. That was in 2012. And currently now, UNECA argues that Africa's share of world trade remains at just about 3% or less. So nothing really has improved in over a decade. So if we consider that the current total value of global trade in our day is about between 30 and $33 trillion, Africa only having at most 4% of that is quite frightening and very inadequate for our future development and well-being. So clearly, there's a great impetus and it's urgent for Africa to integrate better into the global economy. And this is something that hopefully this G20 being hosted by South Africa will allow for people to formulate solutions on how that can be improved. Okay, and then also, can we have the next graphic, please, Lily? Now, right, this graphic shows the share of the global share of foreign direct investment throughout the world. And once again, if we look at Africa's share, Africa is at the bottom, as you can see. Last year in 2022, Africa had 53 billion and 54 billion US dollars of foreign direct investment. And as you can see, as compared to North America, developing economies in general as an average, and Europe, Europe is actually in a difficult situation. But as compared to the world average, Africa is way below what is ideal in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. So in that sense, the Compact with Africa is a very important initiative because we are in dire need of more and specialized foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment of 54 billion or 53 billion in 2024, 2025 is highly inadequate. So how can we get a greater share of global FDI, especially noting that there is 1.3 trillion of the total value of FDI, and Africa is only getting 53 billion of that. Yeah, so something needs to change there as well. And then, sorry, Lily, could you show us the next graphic as well? And also, what is quite interesting and why the G20 is an important forum is that, as we can see, some of the largest economies in the world who are in the G7 and also, part of the G20 are key investors in Africa. So, one of the top investors in Africa is the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Netherlands, followed by France, the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Germany and Switzerland as well. But South Africa, as you can see, is also a big investor on the continent, which is good and a very positive aspect. But the point here I'm trying to highlight is that the G20 is an important forum because it brings northern and southern partners together. So advanced economies are still very important for Africa's development. So yes, BRICS is important, South-South cooperation is important, but we also mustn't forget that we need to still have those ties to the global north advanced economies, especially as they remain the key investors in our continent. And for us to have a greater share of that share of foreign direct investment, we'll definitely need to deepen some of our trade ties and economic ties with advanced economies. Right. And then the last slide, Lily. Thank you so much. Right. And this slide relates more to human capital investment. So as I said, Africa's greatest asset is its young population, right? Its people generally. And this graphic shows the investment in healthcare, by African countries, lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries. Of course, African countries overlap. Some African countries are low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income. But what is worrying for me, as you can see, is that the average, and you can see the green line, the average for Africa is way below the general average of lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries in terms of investing in healthcare. So Africa is only spending, just roughly about hundreds of billions of dollars in keeping its people healthy. Whilst if you look at the upper middle income share of what is invested, it goes into almost the trillions. Okay, so we need to improve how we also invest in our people because our people are our greatest asset. Yeah, so once again, that's why the G20 forum and initiatives such as the Compact Africa are very important. So that's what I just wanted to highlight. Thank you very much. Right, and now I'll head over to our speakers. And the first speaker we'll have is Madam Lebogang Ramafoko, and she's the Executive Director of Oxfam South Africa. She has over 10 experience as a Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director within the non-profit sector. She's a strategic feminist thinker, feminist leader, and seasoned manager who's passionate about advancing social justice, health equity, and gender equality. She has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's prestigious Kennedy School of Government. Madam Ramafoko has had an illustrious career in public service and civil society, including as Chief Executive Officer of Soul City, which is a social justice advocacy organization, between 2011 and 2019, and as well as a commissioning editor for the South African Broadcasting Commission, SABC. And she continues the good work with Oxfam. Madam Ramafoko, please, I would like to invite you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, esteemed participants, panelists, all protocol observed. It is indeed a privilege and an honor for me to be part of this critical discussion. As introduced, I speak from the perspective of Oxfam South Africa, advocating for transformative policies that tackle inequality and promote justice. I address you as a member of civil society whose mission is to work in solidarity in amplifying the voices of the most affected by poverty, hunger, and inequality, who on the main are women, they are youth, they are also people living with disabilities, and those that are in the LGBTIQ plus communities. Indeed, we just concluded the G20 summit in Brazil, and we can really be happy and proud about the legacy that President Lula and Brazil has left us with, which is a legacy that mainly recognizes that the world cannot operate in a manner that it has in order for us to address some of the major issues around inequality and poverty, which mainly affects countries in the global south. And so this year's G20 has made history, with finance ministers committing to work together to tax the richest individuals. Now, what is left for South Africa, and indeed Africa, because this is a moment for Africa, that leaders must do is to agree on a global standard on taxing the richest 1% at rates that are high enough to bring down inequality. And South Africa must continue their support for a global deal to tax the super rich under our G20 presidency, supported by the AU, who also join the G20. Why this is important is that it can raise trillions of dollars, which are really crucial in tackling poverty and hunger, and also the climate and inequality crises that we are facing at the moment. We are living in a world where extreme wealth is out of control and the richest people pay less tax, and it continues. 31% of wealth in the G20 belongs to the top 100%, while the bottom half, mainly in Africa and Africans, owning just 5% of wealth. The world's 16 richest people would still be billionaires, even if 99% of their wealth vanished overnight. In a country like South Africa that has the super rich as 5 individuals, 4 of whom being white, male billionaires, also speaks to our history of apartheid and oppression. Therefore, when we are addressing taxing the super rich, particularly in countries like Africa, we are also redressing the legacy of apartheid and colonization. Since 1980, the top 1% of earners in the G20 countries have seen their income share rocket by up to 45%, while top income rates on them have plummeted. Tax rates have plummeted by roughly a third. We will therefore not be able to achieve the kind of change that will center people above profits if we do not deal with the issues of taxing the super rich. The other issue that the Brazil presidency put on the table, which mainly affects Africa and the global south, is the issue of hunger, food security, and climate. It is encouraging to see that the South African G20 presidency is prioritizing a task force on food security with a focus on food pricing and commodity speculation, which reinforces the need for leveraging the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and optimizing value chains to not only create jobs in the agriculture sector, but also food security and secure decent livelihoods. Therefore, participatory frameworks that center policy discussions on women's voices and lived experience and potential value add in economic activity need to be placed at the top of the agenda. The Global Alliance on Food that President Lula, during their presidency on the G20, put on the table is a good step. But the issues of hunger intertwine with issues of gender, they intertwine with issues of land rights, they intertwine with issues of of weather. And for us, in order for us to deal with the issues of hunger, we need to deal with the issues of climate. And for us, it is important that the G20 must also address the quality of climate finance through transparent, verifiable, and accountable reporting that will ensure that climate financing is provided and implemented in a way that is participatory and locally led, socially just, gender responsive, and consistent with human rights standards. And what is also very, very important is to make sure, and this is what Oxfam underscores, that climate finance should not be in the form of loans, which will be a perpetrator and a perpetuator of previous predatory lending cycles, but rather that climate finance be facilitated on a grant basis. We also urge our governments, as we deal with the issues of climate finance, to understand that small-scale farmers are really at the core of providing food for Africa. And yet, when we speak about loss and damage fund, when we speak about responses to climate adversities, but not only climate, to crises like the COVID-19 pandemic that really regressed the progress that many African countries had made in addressing issues of poverty, but also economic acceleration in Africa. We have seen how we have largely left out those that are in the so-called informal economy, but also small-scale farmers who by and large are really feeding Africa and will make sure that at a very local level, they are going to push back on some of the gains that have been eroded as a result of climate, which will unfortunately make it impossible for us to even achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. As I said earlier, there is no way that we can deal with issues of climate financing, food and hunger without dealing with issues of debt. I'm sure all of us in the opening that was made by our esteemed chairperson, we also saw the limited investment of Africa in health. But this is not because African countries do not care about its people. In the recent study that was done by Oxfam, released in October of 2024, which really tracks the commitment to reducing inequality index, countries like Zambia performed poorly on labor income indicators, while Zimbabwe is among the bottom 10 performers on the overall on inequality reduction globally. But a lot of these countries that are in the bottom 10 are countries that are heavily indebted and are absolutely carrying loans that they are servicing at the expense of really investing in their people, by investing in education, by investing in social protection, and also investing in health. This year, Africa is spending 34% of revenue in servicing debt, a situation that the European carbon tax, the controversial carbon border adjustment mechanism, could contribute to stoking further, because it is eroding needed resources to fund critical development agenda in Africa and putting that in the hands of Europe. The African Development Bank chief pointed out that such a trade tax could cost Africa a yearly 25 billion US dollars in revenues that are needed to fund critical public services. So we can also not speak about Africa being part of this compact, which is necessary, without talking about how are we going to transform and even in many instances cancel the debt that is basically enslaving Africa again. The issue of debt is not going to go away. African countries, like many other countries in the world, are going to have to lend money in order to basically support a number of major infrastructural and other development needs. But is the playing field level when we look at the financial architecture, the global finance architecture? Are the terms of the loans that many African countries get into transparent, where communities are able to see what is being the terms of those loans? And is Africa coming onto the negotiating table, understanding that the global north and the so-called developed countries are not ahistorical? The development of the global north happened, as we know, in a period of colonization, where many of the resources of Africa, and even at the moment, the wars that are fought on the continent of Africa are as a result of the destabilization of Africa that happened during the era of colonization. Therefore, it is my humble view that we cannot achieve equality and equity if we do not address the issues of the loans that are being given to Africa and the global financial architecture, which also includes the issues of illicit financial flows in Africa. The other issue that is very important for Oxfam and Oxfam South Africa is access to energy. An estimated 600 million people, roughly 53% of total population, lack access to electricity, and 970 million lack access to clean cooking. In Southern Africa, this reality is even more precarious. 32% of rural populations are without access to electricity, and only about half of the region's population have access to electricity with coal, which is a fossil fuel that is also causing damage to the environment. But it is not only access to electricity and energy that is the problem. As we have seen in South Africa, that has experienced the power crisis that signaled a massive electricity blackouts. It has also seen how it has contributed to unemployment, to a rising in job losses as manufacturing has declined, which has disproportionately affected marginalized communities, particularly women and children. But even when electricity is available, Oxfam South Africa and Oxfam US recently conducted a study that looked at the access of electricity from a gendered lens. I had the privilege of sitting in the Western Cape. Normally, Cape Town is heralded as this beautiful place, almost like a panacea in Africa. But on the back doors, or in the back door of the beauty of Table Mountain and all the beauty and the beautiful wines that are exported into all parts of Africa, were farm workers who were telling us that because of the cost of electricity, which is not equitable, many of them on many nights have to choose whether to put food on the table or to buy electricity. This happens in a country where its government for 30 years has told us that it is a developmental state. And yet, those that are producing food to not only feed South Africans and Africans, but to export the various wines and other produce are unable to keep the lights on. Surely, as we think about the G20 coming into Africa, issues that continue to marginalize informal traders, including informal traders in SADC countries. Another report that was issued by our partners in Oxfam in Southern Africa showed that 70% of informal traders, cross-border trade, is done by women, but they face significant investment gaps in their business, despite a huge potential they have on intra-African trade. Last but not least is the case for young people. Africa is inherently comprised of a young population, but it straddles behind the developed world when it comes to opportunities for advancement to tackle the triple challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. We also are lagging behind with technology, with digital advancement, and yet we are at the door of AI, where there is an opportunity to create not only development, but jobs and a new skill set if we really wanted to keep up with the world. However, when you get into many, many spaces of decision-making, sadly speaking, it is still men. In many political fora, it is still older men and young people. When they are invited in the spaces, they are to show face, they are to be there. But when you speak about how countries are investing in young people, in their ideas, in their vibrancy, how many of them, particularly young people living with disabilities, particularly young women, they are nowhere to be seen. So as we look at the G20, there is a lot that we can advance in terms of transformational development policies, transformational economic policies that will see to us putting inequality as a working group within the G20, which is something that Brazil has put on the table, in supporting the global hunger forum that Brazil put on the table, in advocating for climate finance, especially because next year as well, COP30 will be held in Brazil, which is in the global south. But there is also an issue of debt, which speaks to the way the global financial architecture. And as we sit, or as we think about joining this impact, the compact for Africa, we need to be bringing some of these conversations on the table. But the investment in the human capital of Africa will not happen if we don't center the voices of women and young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Ramafoko, for that, insightful and eloquent critique. It's very good critique of the challenges that we're facing. And you noted a number of things that I'll just try to quickly go through over here. You noted that it's very important for us to try and have and advocate for a fairer global economic system. So you place an emphasis on economic justice, and you're noting that the share of financial resources remains a key impediment for development for the continent. And you also noted that food security is still a challenge for us, particularly in terms of the price of food, the affordability of food, not just the climate effects, but also how people are they able to afford to purchase food. And you noted that it's very important for us to think of how can we standardize, continental trade in terms of food products and food pricing. So we definitely need to step up how we implement and formulate policies around AfTA. And part of the reason why we have a low share of global trade is because we're not doing enough intra-continental trade as well. So maybe that has got a spillover effect in terms of how food is priced. You also noted something about the informal economy, and this is very important because the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa notes that 86%, I'll repeat, 86% of total employment in Africa is within the informal sector. Okay, so the majority of Africans are employed in the informal sector, right? And this is a huge, huge, huge issue, right? And also, I think there's another important statistic, which I'll find later. So this begs the question of where is the private sector investment going to? If most of the people are employed in the informal sector, where then does this FDI go to? Where are the jobs being created by the foreign direct investment? Okay, so we need to kind of question that as well, right? And also, debt sustainability remains a huge challenge for the continent as well. And then lastly, I think something that's very important is, and I feel strongly about this as well, is the importance of investing in human capital. I think especially our young people, I think that is Africa's greatest asset, right? And I think one key recommendation that should be taken forward, and hopefully we can discuss this later, is the importance of establishing an inequality working group within the G20. I think that's a very important recommendation, and maybe that's something that we should try and advocate for throughout the year. Thank you so much, Madam Ramafoko. Right. I'd like to head over to our next speaker now, who is Ambassador Mandisi Pashwa. He has had a remarkable career in public service and served South Africa in many capacities. He is in some ways the personification of a diligent public servant. He actually owes us, I believe, as the body politic and public of South Africa, a book based on his leadership experiences. His contribution to South Africa's economic development is significant and noteworthy. Most recently, he has served as South Africa's ambassador to Rwanda, but prior to that, he was South Africa's ambassador to Mozambique, and before that, he was the ambassador to Russia. But even before he went into diplomacy, and also quite relevant for this dialogue today, he's a former G20 Sherpa. A Sherpa means that he was a representative of the South African government on G20 forums. This was in 2010. So the positions he's held in government, Ambassador Pashwa, include as Minister of Trade and Industry of the Republic of South Africa from 2004 to 2009. He also served as a Member of Parliament between 1994 and 2009. And he was the Deputy Minister of Finance from 1999 to 2004, and also Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Finance between 1997 and 1999. He holds a master's degree in financial economics from the University of London, and also the diploma in economic principles from the same university, University of London. He also studied electrical engineering in the 1980s, and he played a notable role in the anti-apartheid struggle. He went into exile in November of 1985. And he also involved in the Convention for Democratic South Africa and multi-party negotiations, CODESA, between 1991 and 1993. He's a former NEC National Executive Committee member of the ANC between 1999 and 2007. Ambassador, I'm very happy that you could make time to join us. I know that you had a lot of technical and logistical challenges. So we are very pleased to have you join us. Thank you so much for making time. Please, I'd like to invite you to speak.
Thank you very much, Tawanda. Good morning to everyone. And thanks for that introduction, which sometimes makes you want to hide. And thanks to Auslebo for your insightful presentation. I just have to say as I begin that my big regret, today is that I'm not going to be able to stay throughout the session because there's an event that involves the head of state here in Rwanda, which I thought I could delegate, but unfortunately I cannot. And so at about 11, I will need to step off this platform. And I truly regret that because I sort of had two sets of notes. One, what I was going to use now is sort of an overview of South Africa's presidents of the G20, and also come back with some of sort of more pointed issues which I wish to highlight, at the end as part of my closing remarks. So with the limited time, left, I'm going to try and run through the sort of overview notes. The presidency of the G20 by South Africa it's a unique opportunity to place the economic development imperatives of the African continent on the global economic policy formulation agenda to effect the necessary reforms. South Africa's G20 presidency, which is the first time in history that an African country has presided over this block of developing and developed countries, representing approximately 85% of the world's GDP, more than 75% of world trade, and around 2/3 of the world's population, is indeed a significant moment. It also represents a major stride towards achieving Africa's aspiration of becoming a strong, united, and influential global player and partner. The G20 presidency, while being a privilege and an honor, also comes with tremendous responsibility. This responsibility is even greater given that we live in what the United Nations Secretary General calls a world of impunity, of inequality, and of deep uncertainty, all fraying at the seams of our global order. Notably, structured and institutionalized inequality have become a major threat to global economic growth and stability. This inequality is most prevalent in the global south and in Africa in particular, and is manifested through critical challenges such as a lack of predictable and sustainable financing and capacity building for climate action, extreme vulnerability to pandemics and other global public health emergencies, and crippling debt which forces many countries to forego their developmental programs to service exorbitant debts. It is against this background that there are high expectations and a heavy responsibility on South Africa to drive a progressive, inclusive, and development-oriented G20 presidency. South Africa will therefore use its presidency to ensure that the G20 contributes to reinvigorating and strengthening multilateralism and creating consensus around issues that affect our collective future. Given its significant heft, the role of G20 in creating the foundation for global economic stability, a vital catalyst for economic development, and implementing consequential global commitments, such as the Pact for the Future and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and indeed our blueprint, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, cannot be overstated. As we have stated before, the African Union's inclusion in the G20 is long overdue and is necessary to amplify Africa's voice in global economic governance, whilst ensuring that the development priorities of the African continent and the global south find expression firmly and permanently onto the agenda of the G20. President Ramaphosa made a commitment as early as February 2024 during his State of the Nation address to place Africa's development at the top of our G20 presidency. To this end, the AU's 6 priorities for its participation in the G20 all find expression in South Africa's theme: high-level deliverables and the priorities to be advanced in the various working groups under both the Sherpa and finance tracks. Furthermore, South Africa's overall G20 theme and priorities are aligned to our foreign policy, which is underpinned by our deep commitment to Pan-Africanism and progressive international solidarity. South Africa will use the G20 platform to shine the spotlight on the African Union's Agenda 2063. This presidency will be held under the theme Solidarity, Equality, and Sustainability, a theme that seeks to harness global will and capabilities to confront the enormous challenges the world is facing. The high-level deliverables and priorities under this theme lie at the core of the original G20 mandate of promoting strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Under this theme, South Africa will be advancing the following. Four national priorities which will be pursued through the relevant working groups: strengthening disaster resilience and response, ensuring debt sustainability for low-income countries, mobilizing finance for a just energy transition, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. The next issue is that there are going to be 3 high-level task forces which are thematic in their formulation. Task Force 1 is one on inclusive growth, industrialization, employment, and reduced inequality. The second task force, food security. And the third one, artificial intelligence, data governance, and innovation for sustainable development. It is also intended to have a review of the work of the G20 at 20 years, a reflection on key achievements and the way forward, which will also feature as one of South Africa's deliverables. And it is also intended to have one commission. South Africa proposes the establishment of a cost of capital commission during its G20 presidency. This will also be pursued through the Sherpa track. And one effective compact. South Africa will work with all G20 members to pursue a broadened G20 and effective compact with Africa, which includes increasing the number of participating AU members in the compact with Africa. I think as we speak, we have about 12 or 13 African member countries that have signed up to this compact with Africa. And it's actually quite important that it is something that shows, the change in mentality and I think the posture and stance of Africa in its engagement with the world. It's not a compact for Africa, it is a compact with Africa, which reflects, our changed thinking in terms of how we want to engage with the various partners in the world. The compact with Africa, the G20 has started paying more attention to Africa in recent years. Under the Chinese presidency in 2016, the G20 made industrialization in Africa a high priority. And this was followed by the compact with Africa under the German presidency in 2017. The compact with Africa, co-chaired by South Africa and Germany, is designed to facilitate economic reforms across the continent and to attract investment from pools of private sector funds in the global north. The compact is a pioneering initiative to support Africa's ambition to mobilize domestic and international savings through an improved investment framework. The initiative is based on the premise that accelerated economic development is achievable when African countries, G20 partner countries, and international organizations work together to create a better environment for private investment to lift the standard of living for our people. The Compact with Africa initiative is an instrument that can support the implementation of the African Union's Agenda 2063, its Agenda 2030 on sustainable development, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, and the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative, led by President of South Africa. It is significant that this initiative has been developed as a partnership where each African country is able to define its own priorities and needs. This is critical for ensuring the success and continuity of the compact. In a sense, I think the approach that has been taken with the compact with Africa, on the compact with Africa, is very similar to the approach that was taken with the Africa peer review mechanism. After a lot of argument, with some feeling that it's got to be obligatory, we settled on voluntary participation on the peer review mechanism. So it's a similar approach, but we would still, like to see more African countries participating in this compact with Africa. The compact also represents a firm political commitment from participating African countries to new developmental and governance approaches that will unlock economic activity. Thus far, 13 African countries have joined the compact: Benin, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, Morocco, Rwanda, Senegal, Togo, and Tunisia. And notably, the DRC is the only country from SADC which is in this list. We applaud fellow African countries that are participating in this initiative, demonstrating the value of global cooperation and coordination towards an industrialized and prosperous Africa. We are convinced that the impact of the Compact with Africa initiative will be enhanced by the involvement of development finance institutions. And in this regard, we applaud organizations such as the African Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Among other things, these institutions have expertise and approaches that could be used to mobilize resources for Africa's infrastructure. In our efforts to scale up finance, we cannot omit the important role of private sector finance, which I think is an issue that Auslebo raised in her remarks. Where does the private sector financing go? Indeed, G20 engagement with the private sector remains critical if we are to achieve many of the goals we have set for ourselves. South Africa's G20 presidency will continue to work with business and other stakeholders in order to unlock the global economy's full potential. The Compact with Africa has been brought back to the forefront in the November 2024 Rio de Janeiro Declaration, where G20 leaders reiterated their strong support to Africa, including through the Compact with Africa and the G20 initiative on supporting industrialization in Africa and LDCs, and support the African Union to realize the trade and economic integration and aspirations under its Agenda 2063 as it enters its second decade of implementation. But though it has been well received among African leaders, the Compact nonetheless perpetuates the trend of restricting African engagement to developmental issues. What is most needed is sustainable investment as well, and for African economies to create a climate for investors. Rather, it's a climate of certainty for investors. The rise in global commodity prices and the coming into operation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area opens up many and numerous opportunities for African economies. This requires taking advantage of the opportunities in emerging sectors such as the green economy, renewable energy, and expanding Africa's manufacturing base and capacity through massive industrialization. There are mixed results on what the Compact with Africa has delivered now in its 7th year. There have been a number of initiatives, including the creation of a fund by Germany to provide loans and equity to European SMEs to invest in Africa and in African SMEs. In 2023, Germany announced an investment of 4 billion euros in green projects between 2023 and 2030 as part of the EU-Africa Green Energy Initiative. The European Union will contribute 3.4 billion euros to this initiative in the form of grants. However, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development's 2023 World Investment Report reflected that FDI flows to Africa have remained relatively stable over the past 5 years. Germany only directs around 1% of its total investments to Africa. To translate promising policy frameworks into scaled up inclusive growth, industrialization, employment, and reduced inequality impacts in Africa, South Africa's G20 presidency will also champion an elevated Compact with Africa initiative with the following issues: a broadened scope and approach integrating elements of the finance and Sherpa tracks, including the enabling a macro financial and business reforms, promoting entrepreneurship, and strengthening the small, medium, and micro enterprise ecosystem, as well as improving employability of people, particularly for youth and women. Again, issues that Auslebo raised. This will be done in the context of the risks and opportunities associated with climate change and green transitions, demographic transitions, and technological innovations. The next is the issue of striving for an increased number of participating African Union members. Third, broadened Compact with Africa partnerships with G20 countries and international organizations to strengthen alignment of approaches and synergy of programs for scaled up tangible outcomes in terms of inclusive growth and jobs in Africa. With our stated priorities and high-level deliverables, and most importantly, in partnership with all of society, we believe we can deliver a transformative G20 presidency and leave a permanent legacy for South Africa and the whole of the African continent. I end there, Tawanda, and once again, I truly regret that I cannot stay for the rest of the session because there are, very pointed issues that I had sort of put together as remarks I would want to make, especially the issues that speak to us as African countries, but also as the African Union. But I'm hoping that this is not the last discussion that we are going to have on the G20 and the Compact with Africa. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Ambassador, for making time once again. And please, we await that book. I think you have many valuable insights as your presentation showed, and you have extensive experience in both, macroeconomic policy, industrial policy. So we really await, some of what you have been thinking of over the years, and therefore we love to have you back on this forum as well.
Yeah, you continue to prick my conscience of the issue of the book. No, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Unfortunately, I have to run now.
All right, thank you so much,
be able to
Ambassador.
listen to the next. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right. Okay.
All right.
Right. Yes, so that was a very informative and perceptive overview of the G20 and in relation to the Compact with Africa provided by Ambassador Mpashwa. And he noted a number of things. South Africa has a tremendous responsibility in terms of hosting this particular G20, the first been hosted on African soil. And especially in terms of how South Africa has to drive a development-oriented G20, which is very, that's a key issue. But also, he noted that South Africa places African concerns at the apex of South Africa's G20 approach, therefore highlighting South Africa's consistent commitment to the African agenda. But one thing that I just thought about was that it's a bit, tragic, and hopefully maybe the other speakers, as well as people who have joined us for this dialogue, can speak to the issue of how maybe this G20 provides a context in which we can have a homegrown initiative, or rather revitalize what the original NEPAD sought to do, right? And NEPAD sought to have, continental standards relating to governance and economics throughout the continent, right? So that we could, generate prosperity through greater continental integration, but also to allow for greater, integration into the global economy. So maybe it's time to revisit how maybe Africa needs a NEPAD version 0.2 that focuses on those governance and economic continent-wide standards that will help us to integrate better into the global economy, but also to improve how we deal with each other politically and economically. Right, I would like to move on to...
Unfortunately, Tawanda,
yes,
that was one... Unfortunately, that is one of the issues that I had sort of identified to speak to, at the end, in my closing presentations, and I
go
truly
ahead,
regret
say something about it, please, Ambassador. If you have time, please.
No. I've run out of time. I've run out of time, and
all right, we'll call you next time.
I don't want to do an injustice to the remarks. I will reserve those for a future discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
All right.
All right.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Then we'd like to move on to our next speaker, who's Madam Peter Wolper. She's the Managing Director of Sustainable Energy Africa, SEA. She's worked in the energy and climate sectors for over 17 years. Hence, she has extensive experience dealing with climate and green issues. Peter has worked in the field of psychiatric social work in the United Kingdom before returning to South Africa in 1996 to work in the development sector. So she has a long track record of work in the energy and development sectors. Peter joined Sustainable Energy Africa in March of 2008, and so she has definitely worked for the public good for most of her adult life. She's also worked at a high level on a range of climate change and energy projects. This has included research, facilitation, capacity building, data analysis, and policy development within most sectors of government, including the National Planning Commission, the NPC. She's written papers, contributed publications, and given talks on sustainable energy and climate change. She has a degree in sociology from the University of Essex and a Master's of Science in Social Administration and Social Work Studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And her parents are renowned anti-activists, anti-apartheid activists. Right, please, I'd like to welcome you to the floor, Peter.
Thank you for that amazing introduction. Just one slight thing, I'm no longer Managing Director of Sustainable Energy Africa. I've been working independently for about 4 years, but
I apologize profusely. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. And I feel very privileged that you've invited me to speak, and really interesting listening to the ambassador and Lebogang, really interesting presentations. I'm coming from a very different angle, and I am honing in on just transition and climate change. And I'm going to raise, I hope, some challenging some challenges to this audience, to the G20 presidency here in South Africa. So I'm going to go through most of what I have here, sort of images. I'm using a different medium. So if we think about the Africa picture, oh, sorry, I've got, I can't, there. We all know there are very high levels of poverty and inequality. The levels of energy access are extremely, very low. 43% of people had lacked access to electricity, and I think as Lebogang, you were referring to, also clean cooking is a major issue. And so I see one of my figures has dropped off. But but I can't remember. I really apologize what the percentage, a huge percentage of premature deaths in Africa are caused from indoor air pollution. So that figure was in 2021. I'll try and find the correct figure for you a bit later. So Africa's 18% of global population and account for 6% of global energy use, and 30% of global disease burden from indoor air pollution. So speaks to the health issues that both speakers have raised. Low per capita emissions, and very interesting. If you look at the renewable energy that investment within Africa, the installed capacity is 3% compared to a global 12% capacity. So these figures are all from 2021. There is very little investment going into Africa, which talks to some of the financial issues that have already been raised. So, you know, I think this photograph is so poignant. The respiratory diseases that we can see in Africa, but a lot of what I'm going to talk to today is honing in on South Africa. Children who are missing school, who have asthma or various respiratory diseases. It's actually heartbreaking. These figures are very old, but it just gives you a snapshot. So if you look here, Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, these are carbon emissions. And if you see going down here, Germany, the EU, United States, but the world, our emissions in our continent are relatively are tiny. In South Africa, they're relative to Sub-Saharan Africa in particular is small. And here you can see similarly with electricity consumption. I mean, look at these African countries down here. There's Sub-Saharan Africa, there's the world. Okay, South Africa, we're high, and I'll tell you why in a second. I mean, if you look at the bottom of this cartoon, so the top, the figures are a bit out of date, but low income equals low energy consumption. The shack lands is where energy inequality leads to climate risk and vulnerability. And here we can see the coal being burnt. So let's hone in on South Africa. This is a photograph taken in Mpumalanga, and I think you will all know it's the heart of our coal region. Our economy is built around a minerals energy complex. And most of our electricity is still coming from coal. SASOL, our coal to liquid fuel, and Eskom, our electricity utility, account for, I think it's over 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is we have a renewable energy policies in place, and we do have a growing renewable energy, but there are problems, and I'm not going to go into that for this presentation. So we're one of the highest carbon emitters, and we are going through an energy transition. So I was asked to really hone in on the G20 focus on it's just energy transition, but I'm going to talk about just transition. So for me, a just transition doesn't only incorporate energy. We're looking at the whole ecosystem, at adaptation, at biodiversity, and I think it's quite important to bear that in mind. And I think all of us in the room are familiar that and there's been reference to 30 years into democracy, that when the ANC came into power, it was about trying to address the terrible legacies of the apartheid era. So we started off with the redistribution and development program, which included electrification, housing, and water programs. And I think some of this background, bear with me, it's important. I just want to make one point around the RDP, which did lead to some massive changes. However, we are still facing high unemployment, high levels of inequality, poverty, and I would add energy poverty in there. So what was the RDP the start of a range of policies that somebody I interviewed a year ago talks about welfare policies, that they didn't lead to systemic changes. And I just want to flag that now. I'll come back to it. So we've now started, well, for a number of years, to address climate change, and what's high on the agenda is transforming to low carbon, climate resilient country, and that we should do this within a just transition framework. So now a lot of what I'm going to focus on now is around what do we mean by just. So the last two bullets are kind of framing broadly what is meant by just, although there's not full agreement. I think it's good enough here. We've got our Climate Change Act, which I've quoted, which means a shift towards a low carbon, climate resilient economy and society, and ecologically sustainable economies and societies which contribute towards the creation of decent work for all, social inclusion, and eradication of poverty. So for me, the just, and I go back now to the third bullet, is that those who have been most impacted by coal-based extractivist economy should not be negatively impacted through the transition, but most importantly, that we've got to bring the voices of the voiceless into the process of finding solutions and implementing this transition. And in the policies, I don't think it's just here, not just here in South Africa, but across Africa and globally, we're talking about procedural justice, which is process of how you include people, distributive justice broadly, that you recompense or find ways, providing jobs, reskilling, building entrepreneurial programs, and restorative justice relates to the legacy of apartheid, but for me brings in issues around trauma that I'm going to come back to. So if we look at South Africa, we've got very high unemployment, very, very high youth unemployment, and amongst young women. We've got 63% of the population living in poverty, and we've got 47% of energy poverty, although I suspect that figure is higher now. Yes, the RDP has resulted in way higher levels of electrification in the country. However, we still have many, many people without access to electricity, and that's particularly prevalent in the informal sector and amongst backyard dwellers. And even if the figure of electrification, which is at 87%, those who have access are not using electricity for all their energy needs because they cannot afford to do so, despite actually subsidies in place in this country. So the poor are still using a mix of fuels because of affordability, and those fuels are generally unsafe, and then we see high level of fires in informal settlements. Also, if we start to look at the gendered side of energy and energy poverty, you think of time used for procuring different forms of energy, takes women away from potential work. They're generally responsible for household tasks. And I think, Lebogang, you also spoke to this very poignantly, that and we've seen many studies that show social grants that people receive in South Africa are not using those grants for food. Actually, they're being used for energy purposes. And so hunger and malnutrition are rife. Also, the other health element that I didn't speak to is if you think about paraffin that's sold in Coke bottles. So people buy small amounts, put it in Coke bottles. Children are ingesting accidentally. We're seeing many health poisoning and health problems. And so here in South Africa, despite being close to power stations in the Mpumalanga area, we're seeing many informal settlements without access to electricity. We know there's air and water pollution. Eskom and SASO negotiated non-compliance. Despite all the policies that sit on the table. So now let's think about all of this in relation to the G20 and the themes. Antonio Guterres said that the forthcoming G20 presidencies must encourage a paradigm shift and accelerate the implementation of practical solutions. And this includes situating inequality. Sorry, I can't see because the panel, at the heart of economic policy making. And that is what I want to focus on now. I mean, we've heard very eloquently some of the challenges. I've spoken a little bit around the challenges around the just transition. I haven't talked about the impact of climate change on water, on land, on food, on farming, all impacting poorer people than the rich or the middle income people. So we have these themes that the ambassador spoke about: solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And the G20 has numerous work streams. There's the Sherpa, the finance streams, but within each of those, within both of those are many work streams, many task teams, many platforms discussing and contributing to this presidency, such as this one. All of us talking a particular, how can I put it? We are all familiar with the terms. We are talking to people who understand the issues. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Climate change is cross-cutting. I've just given you a teeny snapshot. I was told I had 10 minutes, so I haven't gone into any detail. It crosses all sectors. It intersects with all these work streams and themes that have been put forward by the G20. It intersects with all areas of our lives. And we have to be conscious of the where climate change comes from, and the fact that for years and years we've had the COP talks, we've had countries and talking about what needs to change. We've got activists, we've got policymakers, but it's a failure of many systems that has allowed a situation to continue that further entrenches poverty and inequality. And we need to maybe unpack and understand how they all intersect. So I wonder, when I read some of the material and looked at what is going to happen in this next year around the South African G20 presidency, how do we hold all these themes? I'm not saying that detailed areas need to be gone into, but how do we hold the whole? How do we connect the dots? So I feel that what is being asked by Guterres around this paradigm shift, I would like to ask this group and maybe further conversations is, how do we bring something new to the table? How do we look with new eyes and new ideas? Because we know the issues, we know the problems. We don't need to outline them. We need to find a way to bring action. How do we speak so that all people hear? And how do we listen so that all people can speak? Reminds me of a book I read when my children were really young. You know, how to speak so kids will hear, and how to listen. It holds for this, because we have to engage. If we're holding the just transition, we need to be engaging with the poorest of the poor, with the people who are not sitting in these kind of workshops. We need a holistic approach. We need to find a new way of communicating. We need to bring in the voices of the voiceless. I put this slide up because I recently did some work around on a project on gender and just transition in Mpumalanga. It was part of a pilot project, and we decided to bring in two artists who are doing work around waste, using art as a medium with school children, and they came in, and because it was in Emelanhleni in the coal, in the heart of the coal region, they used these rocks, and these women they just loved engaging with this and using the art as a way of communicating. And what came up in this work was, yes, gender-based violence was really traumatic for us to hear it, but it was the trauma of their lives, of trying to find ways of earning money, of dealing, of working, of living with men who are minors, and the gendered roles that are so entrenched, and how to change that. And it made me realize that we can talk the talk, but and these kind of platforms are needed. I'm not saying we don't need them, and we definitely need change from a political economy level, not only in this country, but across the world. But we also need to reach people like these women who were so hungry for the capacity, the information we were giving them around what is climate change and just transition? What do we mean by gender justice? And how does that intersect with their lived experiences? And I just want to finish with a couple more slides. If I think back, Twanda, you made reference to my parents. They were very active in the struggle here, and so I grew up in exile. And I think about this principle of participation being at the cornerstone of our history and culture. You know, the Freedom Charter that paved the way for the Constitution was born out of engagements and meetings across the country at a time when meetings of that nature were banned. And yet the people met, they put forward their views, and the leadership put together the Freedom Charter. In the early years of our democracy, participatory justice, which is at the heart of the just transition, did continue, I think, quite successfully. And as I've noted here, the Constitution was developed from through consultation. But today, when we're not succeeding. And if you talk to people on the ground, despite the Presidential Climate Commission running a whole range of engagements, their voices aren't coming through. Local government officials, they say public participation is tick box and compliance. We need to find a way. If we could do it during the struggle era, we can do it today. And we need holistic, cross-cutting, coordinated approaches. We really need to change the trajectory. We need to bring activism back. And thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I forgot this last
go
slide.
ahead.
It's a cartoon. And now is the century of the African city. I think and this is the opportunity for this G20. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much for that thoughtful overview, but also for challenging us, because you're saying that we have a lot of responsibility. We owe it to the difficult history we've had, and we have to do something to build a better future. And I think from your presentation, what was clear was that human capital and climate have an intimate dynamic. And I think your presentation really highlighted that if we don't deal effectively with climate issues or issues to do with the green economy, energy, and so forth, it will have an adverse impact on the quality of life for our people and human capital. Right. And you gave a good example of how access to energy remains a challenge, as Madam Lebaring noted as well, for many Africans. And I wonder what the impact in terms of health and education is if you don't have access to energy, something that maybe some of us take for granted that we have access to every single day. But if millions don't have access to that, it's obviously impinging on their health, their education, and then obviously affects them as economic actors. Right. And also, I think, if energy remains a challenge, not only in South Africa, but across the continent, and there's also this shift away from fossil fuels to, hydrogen, electricity. And also, people are moving away from minerals. Like, for example, diamonds, people are preferring now to have ethical minerals like synthetic diamonds, right? So maybe this means a rethink of what we've always depended on in terms of, sustaining our economies. And so maybe we have to start seriously thinking about green industrial policy. What does a green industrial policy look like? Because Africa, as you know, is maybe the time of the African city, but Africa needs to industrialize, right? We have to industrialize so that we grow our economies. There's so much potential, but how we industrialize is going to become a huge issue because there are clearly constraints that are there. And maybe we need a more sustainable, climate-focused approach to that. And then you also noted that it's maybe what this G20 allows for us to seriously grapple with a new approach, thinking about new ways around development, ordinary people's participation in economic life. And I think one thing that I probably will come back to as well is this. It was raised by Madam Lobang as well, that this thing of having an explicit working group within the G20 focused on inequality. Yes, thankfully, we've had groups focused on industrialization, industrial policy, groups focused on infusing the G20 frameworks of development. And South Africa was key to those groups being established. But maybe now we need something around especially inequality. All right. And my big question that I keep coming to, I think I've said this for the last the previous two dialogues we had on the G20, where is the African private sector in all of this? The market capitalization of African businesses is hundreds of billions of dollars, right? The stock exchange, if you combine all the stock exchanges within Africa, they have about $1 trillion worth of potential money, right? Although it's a bit problematic if we can access it. But my point is that there are potentially pools of money from homegrown institutions, right? So what role is there for our African private sector, right, to get involved? And lastly, I'll just say that maybe we also need to think of balancing the G20's approach on the state and government level with an approach maybe that is more bottom up. There's a brilliant document that was written in 2008, and it was the SADC Poverty Reduction Plan. And this SADC Poverty Reduction Plan took a bottom up approach, saying that, yes, states can work with ordinary people. Ordinary people in Africa, are applying their trade in difficult circumstances. But nevertheless, Africans, are making their sustenance in the agricultural sector, in the informal sector. And the small and medium businesses are what is the lifeblood of many Africans. So maybe we need to start, matching, these G20 frameworks, such as the Compact with Africa, with our small and medium enterprises at the ground level, and try and generate financial resources, technical expertise for our people within the informal sector who have difficulty accessing finance anyway, right? So maybe our banks, our financial institutions across the continent, the African Development Bank, and our governments need to start seeing how can we aid our people who are really who are really struggling in difficult situations, but making the most of it, right? And how can we match them and help them with the access to resources that they need, especially financial and technical, to upscale the economic enterprises from informality to a more stable, formalized type of system. Right. Anyway, so that's from me. I'll stop there. And I'd like to, open up the discussion and allow people to ask questions and have perspectives from the floor. I've noted that there were some questions in the chat, and I would like to encourage the people who posed some of those points. Please, go ahead and speak if you want to pose a particular question or you want to reframe your question as you posted it in the chat. I note that there's Mr. Pierce Pijou, there's Professor Robert Moore, please feel free to speak. Yes, I see Madam Lobang, your hand is up, please.
Yes, thank you. It's actually based on the question that is on the chat, or the comment on the chat around the return of the Trump presidency and the fact that South Africa will have to hand over to the US because they will be hosting the G20 after South Africa. And while the person who put that comment on the chat, I think it's for Zia Davids, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
I think while the G20 presidency for South Africa is Africa centric, like they put on the chat, I do think that if we take a gendered lens to the G20, the developments in the US should be worrying even for us. And I absolutely, how do we make meaning and practical the issue that we want the G20, including climate finance, to be gender specific? And I think some of the questions that are being asked about the implications of the US presidency, particularly on the reproductive rights for women, is an important conversation that I hope forums like W20, but Africa should itself come out with a very strong voice around what are the issues that we want to put on the agenda, but what are the issues that we would want to lobby the US to continue. Might I add that it is not only going to be the very critical issue of reproductive justice that is, probably at a threat by the administration that we have, but it is also the shrinking of civil spaces. And unfortunately, we are seeing the same in many parts of Africa. We are seeing how we are dealing with protests in Mozambique, in Kenya. And also, I think the whole issue of taxing the super rich. I think there are agendas. This is just in summary what I want to say is that while we want to pursue an Africa-centric G20, we need to be cognizant of the fact that beyond South Africa and Africa, the G20 will be going to the US. And what are we doing with some of those major issues that mainly affect women or affect Africa that we may lose if we are not paying attention when America takes the presidency? So I just wanted to highlight that. And you cannot speak about centering women, even in the G20, even in transforming the economy, when you do not add issues of reproductive justice in the mix, and understanding what a Trump administration means for reproductive justice, not only for the US, but for the resourcing and the funding around the programs that Africa has, around maternal health, around sexual reproductive health and rights, etc. Thanks. That's what I wanted to highlight based on the comment and the question that was on the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. Yes, I see there's Tumelo. Please.
Greetings to all the panelists and all the people that are tuning into this wonderful session. It's Tumelo Ndlovu. I am the chairperson of the ANC Youth League at ward 11. So I'm asking particularly for my ward 97, and probably any other wards in the country. Now, my concern is, and it's a concern and a question, why aren't young people, especially those from marginalized communities, like these marginalized groups, us from the lowest level, man, why aren't we invited to the table to at least have our 2 cents, at least throw in our 2 cents, at least have something to contribute to this? Because I strongly believe that young people should actively engage with and mobilize support for such issues. I mean, these decisions are lasting legacies that today's policymakers pass on to future generations. And poor decisions made now create burdens that we are going to ultimately take on even decades from now, you see. So my question is that why aren't we, just given a seat, or at least a few seats at this table to come in and contribute, because it's our future here that's at stake. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tumelo. Please, would like to take more questions from the floor. See, there's Lily.
I was just wondering if you would like me to read out some of the questions in the chat.
That's great. I'd love it if the people who ask the questions would love to reframe them and ask the speakers. I know to have Piers Pajou, but at the same time, you're free to read from the chat.
Okay, well, if there's no hands, Robin Moore asked, in considering levels of development within Africa and the interests of international investors, what is the role of the quality of governance and consequently the role of critical state institutions related to development, the quality of governance within some African states, the AU, and some regional blocs? And then Munjodzi Mutandiri said, thank you, Lebo, quite insightful and challenging in terms of the work that has to be done to ensure you eloquently raise the issue you eloquently raise on the global agenda in a more meaningful way. Piers Pigot said, to what extent does ongoing dysfunction in the AU and the African regional economic communities undermine the opportunities presented by South Africa's presidency? To what extent are the multilateral dots connected to scaffold these possibilities, especially now the AU has a seat at the table? And also, what does South Africa have a plan with the AU to advance options or prospects for a FTA during its presidency? And then Fozia Davids asked, given the return of the Trump presidency for 2025 and the implication this has on women's reproductive rights as seen in historic US conservative or Republican governments, this has had negative consequences for developing countries, especially through US aid, who have previously been curtailed when it comes to supporting women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. South Africa's mandate or focus at the helm of the G20 presidency focuses largely on Africa-centric issues, rightly so, including the digital divide and not being left out of the AI revolution. Will there be a focus at all on women's health and reproductive rights given our country's progressive stance on this matter? So that's some questions for the panelists to consider responding to.
Thank you so much, Lily. Thank you so much. All right, are there any more hands? Okay, so I mean, I can hand over to the speakers. I think so. That's Madam Peter and Madam Lebo.
I can go first with regards to the question that was asked about youth involvement. There are so many forums that exist for young people to be involved. The G20 has a number of forums. One of them is the Y20. And I would encourage the speaker, I forget his name, Tumelo, that you join the Y20, which is a forum where young people engage with some of the policy proposals that affect young people. There's also the C20, which is Civil Society 20, which is also a platform that works with working groups. And these working groups are really around the thematic areas that we would like to work on. If you go on the Oxfam South Africa website, in October, we had held a kick-off meeting with other partners. There were 7 partners in total, and we were one of them. And the aim of that kickoff meeting was to bring even the C20 Secretariat from Brazil so that we share knowledge about what is the C20, what are the G20, what are the opportunities that exist for civil society to engage with the G20. And when we submitted that report, we also submitted an expression of interest for different stakeholders to participate or in different working groups. So those are but 2 areas that I know of specifically that are spaces that young people could come on board. And these are not South African creations. The Y20 has existed before, and yes, my colleague Bongani has put the link to the report on the chat. You will see the report, you will see what civil society said, and the expression of interest. That will continue until the end of January for people to really sign up. But I think the Y20 is also a critical forum that young people in particular can join and engage with the G20 issues. But let me also say, and I think it is linked to the question that was asked by Fozia, is that we are hosting the G20, but the G20 is not going to address all of our issues for South Africa, because we are a host of a public of a global meeting of G20 plus 1, if you add the AU countries. But Tumelo, I'm happy that you are saying you are part of a political party. I think young people who are in political formations, first and foremost, need to hold their own political parties to account, because they are now in government around issues that are facing young people, issues that are facing people living with disabilities, issues that are facing women and the LGBTQ plus community, especially because in 2026, South Africa is going to the elections. In 2025, Brazil is also going to be going into COP. I liked what Peter said very much around what is the form of communication that we use when we communicate with different stakeholders. And we have worked with partners such as the New Economy Hub. We have worked with partners such as the Alliance to Fight Inequality that are also participating in the G20 in what is called the outsider track. And the outsider track is a track that is intended to make sure that there is mass mobilization and mass communication, so that we make sure that we don't leave anybody behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I come in? Sorry, I can't find raise my hand.
No, it's fine.
I don't know what.
You can raise your real hand.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Lebogang's been saying around reproductive health, and I'm hearing about other platforms for voices to be heard, the youth voice particularly. But I suppose the two other questions, the one around that Robin Moore and the government and state institutions, I'm not 100% clear what you're raising there, and maybe it also links with Piers your comment around dysfunction and how can the South Africa's presidency manage that. So I'm not an expert in the G20 spaces, but I'm very aware where dysfunction is happening and issues around governance and state institutions. So they seem interrelated, these points. I guess it comes back to the questions I was raising. How can this presidency shift the issues to become more pragmatic, perhaps, because the problems that we're sitting with are not new. Problems of governance and weak state institutions are not new. So and that links with the kind of finances that are on the table. So how do we change that? How do we take an opportunity in this presidency, given South Africa's historical ability to change? We made some massive changes. We've stagnated now, but what could we do that's different that might shift things? That's the question I sit with, and I put to this group here, a lot of experience in the room, and there's an opportunity that we 2025's round the corner. We have a year. How can we do it? How do we bring the youth in? How do we change communication? Yeah. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's they're quite important questions.
Sometimes asking the right question is actually the answer, Madam Petter. So please keep asking the questions. Are there any more hands? Yeah, so Tumelo, you know, by participating in SALO forums, and I think I remember you participated in a prior G20 dialogue, you know, you also get then a chance to then link with you know, key stakeholders, you know, like the speakers we just had on this panel, and hopefully they can also take up some of your concerns going forward. But like you referred to, there's also the Y20 and the C20. So, you know, keep supporting us, keep coming to these dialogues, and us as SALO, our mandate is also to support the broader G20 process, especially from a broader civil society point of view. So thank you for you know, always having an interest in what we do, and I hope that you know, you always be able then to link to other key stakeholders and so forth who can advise you on some of the questions that you're raising. Yeah, then I just want to say with Trump, the incoming Trump presidency, you know, international trade might become a bit more combative. So maybe it's in Africa's interest to try and fast track after, you know what I mean? The sooner we can get after up and running and, you know, increase our inter-regional trade, intercontinental trade, it might bode well for us as opposed to dealing with a very harsh global economic framework without also increasing inter-regional trade. So yeah, definitely. I think as far as this question suggests that we need to really think critically about that as well. Right. Any more questions from the floor? Okay. The speakers, do you have any other thoughts you want to share? Any concluding thoughts? Madam Lebayang, Madam Peter?
Yes. I can go. I think there is a question by Robin Moore about in considering levels of development within Africa and the interest of international investors. What is the role of the quality of governance and consequently the role of critical state institutions related to development and the quality of governance within some African states, the AU and some regional blocs? This question intrigues me because I think in a geopolitical manner, we also have a responsibility of understanding that the issue of governance is quite complex, in a sense that, for me, while there are very legitimate questions about governance that needs to be raised, I mean, we have seen something like the state capture in South Africa and how it has eroded necessary development resources into the pockets of individuals. We must balance it with a critical analysis of in whose best interest is weak governance in Africa serving. And I think in my speech, I did speak about the wars that are fought in Africa. Even at the beginning of corruption in South Africa, there were corruptors. There were the whole, it was state arms in a country that had just been democratized, that was not at war, but we had a number of foreign interest in South Africa as the next bastion of leaders that were taking power, who could therefore be corrupted. I'm not making an excuse, nor do I know enough about what happens at the AU. And I do believe, as a civil society organization, that we need to challenge African states, but also globally, around the issue of shrinking public space so that there is transparency. But in a lot of ways, I also think that there is disingenuity in raising issues of governance, when in fact, some of the deals that we are making, some of the loans that we are taking are actually, one of the reasons, the servicing of debt, that is also weakening our governance. And while we speak about, the new green economy, What are the kinds of arrangements that different African countries are getting into with the global players, global business players around the resources in Africa, which ultimately many African leaders are going to get into, one, because they don't act in solidarity with each other, so we don't go as a bloc and negotiate, but also because there are promises for different leaders for their own personal benefit. So it is not by virtue of the fact that we are African that we've got a low quality of governance. We are, in my opinion, in a constant attack by also business practices of the global north. It is not a coincidence that countries that are indebted by IMF and World Bank, and for many other countries, that is the source of a lot of financing, adopt austerity measures and therefore cannot improve quite a lot. But we need to show up as African countries around the transparency in which we do things and also around our own leadership. I just felt that that's a question that we did not address. And I thought I should share my 2 cents worth, as they say, on that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a very important question that you address. And I think it's a shame that Ambassador Mpashwa had to leave, because I think he was trying to also say that maybe as a continent, we need to revisit what we were trying to do with the original NEPAD, which was to have, widespread continental governance and economic standards, have a basic minimum to say, this is how we govern across the continent, right? So that we don't have inconsistent issues around political stability. We always confuse when elections happen, what went wrong, this and that, and also economically, let's integrate, as a continent. Let's make sure that we lower the cost of doing trade together, because that's been a key impediment to our growth. If you look at Asia, why Asia's got one of the highest percentages of share of international trade is because they trade well together as a regional bloc. Southeast Asia, East Asia, as a big community, they trade very well. And that increases their share of the global economy. Same with the Americas, South America, North America, and also, with Europe. And we're the only continent that is not able to, effectively get our trade going regionally. And once we're able to do that, I think our share of global GDP, our share of international trade will increase. And so something that, some visionary African presidents in the past were trying to do. And I think we should revisit some of the ethos of the ideas behind it. Of course, there were some limitations as to why it went wrong. Critiques about it, maybe it was too much of a neoliberal approach. It was going to, jeopardize, African, business, African trade in some ways. But I think it's worth revisiting, this issue of governance and continent-wide economic standards. And then I think, Madam Lebang, you noticed something that was very interesting. I like the term you used. You called it an Afrocentric G20. And I just wanted to ask you very quickly, what will be unique about an Africa-centric G20? And what values would underpin an Afrocentric G20?
I think for me, an Afrocentric G20, and it's also a phrase that was shared by somebody on the chat, is one that puts at the center of the world the issues that Africa has been battling with. I think Peter was also very eloquent in talking about, issues of poverty. For me, a success of an Afrocentric G20 is one that puts on the table the needs of Africa. And there are really two that I think are important. It's about having an inequality working group. We are going to have to talk about inequality because our inequality is not ahistoric. It is reparations, it is restorative justice, it is about addressing the legacy of colonization and apartheid. The second one is around dealing with issues of debt. I think once and for all, Africa needs to put on the table the international global financial architecture and transparency in debt and how it has locked African countries. And I think it is about a G20 that says to particularly the G20 superpowers who hold the largest portion of the global GDP, that they don't exist without Africa. In fact, their success is based on what Africa has to offer. And I think often when we speak, and I think as countries, and I think Peter spoke so eloquently even about our RDP, I get a sense even in South Africa that when we had an opportunity as a new democracy to really champion a transformative agenda, we went for a neoliberal agenda. You know, we wanted everybody to like us. You know, we wanted to play nice. You can't play nice when you have not created the rules of engagement in the first place. And therefore, you know, you can't put certain ingredients in baking, if I am to use an analogy, and expect a different cake.
Exactly.
You can't have trickle down economic policies and think that you are going to address inequality, particularly in a country like South Africa that has years and years of racialized economic practices. And then you come in. I mean, the people who have benefited from the democratic agenda in South Africa are rich and they are white, and they are becoming richer and richer. And we are almost, even in South Africa, having a conversation about inequality where we start even blaming the poor, and we are not reflecting on the policies. And you can extrapolate this for all African countries. I mean, the minute you speak about social spending, people are going to threaten you that investment is not going to come. Well, the investment that comes right now without us centering people is an investment that is extractive. The capitalist system showed us within COVID. COVID made a few people rich. We could not, with the capacity that we have in South Africa, even produce vaccines. When vaccines were taken, we have asked, what are the loans and the terms of the loans that were taken by our country to make sure that they vaccinate its people? So it has always been profit before people. And I think where our governments are absolutely, you know, they want to play nice, it is the role of civil society to remind them that, in fact, you cannot have profits without people. I often say, and it may sound dramatic, that probably when poor people start eating the rich, we will realize that the economy that does not put people at the center is not a sustainable economy. An Afrocentric agenda is an agenda that speaks truth to power. And Africa, while it sits at this table, and the AU, while it sits at this table, we want to call upon it to say that it is not a table of equals. And therefore, they must take the aspirations of African people with them and speak truth to power. And for African communities and civil society organizations to hold them accountable to speak truth to power. This is the moment of not being grateful for the crumbs that are at the table, but to deconstruct the table and build a new table of beyond GDP, a world that is going to say it is immoral to have 1% of the population continue to be so rich at the expense of the bottom 99%. Thanks.
I'd really like to add to that. I won't take long because I see we're over time. I love what you've just said. And, you know, if you go back to the RDP, there was an assumption that there was a consensus at the level of the state as well. And we did. We bought into a neoliberal capitalist system, which has set us on this course of where we are today, I believe. And I was at a lecture the other day with Kumi Naidu speaking, and he asked the audience, you know, what percentage of the global population live in the global north and the global south? And there were various responses in the audience. And he said the figure is 88% of people live in the global south. And he did include China in that. But the reason I'm bringing it as a sort of final thing is I think along with what you were saying, Lebogang, is that we come in almost apologetically as Africans. I'm talking about the continent as well there. and that there's an assumption that these big people in the US and other northern spaces, they know it all, and we're just we're secondary citizens. And you know, there's corruption and really bad stuff happening in the global north. And I would like to add on what you've said, in that we must go there with our heads held high, with pride, and bring a different, something different, new and fresh in this G20 that maybe will even impact on Trump's presidency. Don't even want to think about that. Yeah, so I'll end there. Thanks.
No, thank you so much for both your very insightful critiques and you don't want to be our next AU chair. Maybe you know, we should put like people like you at the African Union, that you can drive things for us. Yeah, so I think the speakers have said their final thoughts, and I think we're run out of time. And I just wanted to say, I think both the speakers have raised a very important point about the South African context. And I think even before the RDP, there was what is known as the Macroeconomic Research Group recommendations, right? And I think they filtered through into the original RDP. And the idea was that, you know, any state that's trying to foster reconstruction needs public spending in order to build up the country. So you invest in your human capital, you invest in social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. And then once that type of spending has been allocated towards redeveloping the country, dealing with issues, you know, the legacy of apartheid, then we let the private sector come in and drive the economy. So I think what happened in South Africa was that the private sector, to be honest, let down South Africa's post-1994 transition. And we still have a situation where the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is one of the highly rated stock exchanges in the world. In fact, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange total market capitalization is almost equal to all of Africa's stock exchanges combined. So South Africa, you know, the amount of private sector pool of money that's in South Africa is competitive at continental level with other regions. And, you know, so there's always this tension in South Africa between what role can the private sector play in driving development, in aiding development, along with the public sector. And what's clear from what we are noticing in terms of the figures is that the public sector in Africa is at its limit, right? And, you know, in other words, the states can't continue to spend money that they probably, in some cases, don't have, or money that is due to things like malfeasance, nepotism, and other problems. We're leaking money, right? And so there has to be some kind of alternative apart from always generating debt, which is becoming unsustainable, as noted by Madam Nabayang. And if we look at the facts, you know, the 250 largest companies in Africa have a total market capitalization of $505 billion. Right. So there's a pool of African money, $505 billion, that can potentially be used to invest in human capital and to generate development. Not to mention the bonds that these private sector entities can allocate or you know, or generate. And then if you look at the total operational stock exchange for Africa is combined, it has a worth of 1.3 trillion. So these are the listed African stock exchanges. So altogether, we've got about 2 trillion of African-based economic resources that can potentially be used for, you know, investment in our people and to invest in infrastructure and so forth. So I'm really adamant that it's time the African private sector came to the table in terms of having serious discussions with civil society, with the public sector around how do we invest in our young people. And our young people are very important in the future. The Tumelos and the Lilies are very important. You know what I mean? They're tomorrow's wealth. And if we don't invest in our young people now and consistently, we're going to have huge problems. Right. So Africa is not a poor continent by any means. We have resources, commodities that the world needs. We have the young people, the most youthful population, and we actually do have an African private sector that is vibrant, that has pools of trillions of US dollars of potential money that we can tap into. So we don't always have to think of always borrowing from external partners. maybe it's time we start also thinking about how can we generate resources continentally? How can we also enhance our inter-regional trade? Because the more we grow our international trade, the better for us in terms of integrating the global economy. Yes, and maybe that's also something that we need to think about when we think of an Afrocentric G20, that self-sustenance and capacity that we have that we're not tapping into. Right, so I'd like to stop there. I've talked so much, and I'd like to thank you once again for joining us, especially at this late time of the year. And I wish you all a festive season, a happy festive season. And please join us again next year for all these dialogues that we'll be doing. We'll be doing a lot of work around the G20. And I would like to thank Rosa Luxembourg, who have funded this dialogue, and our key partner, and also all our other partners as well. So I believe I pleaded with Ineke, to give some not concluding remarks. I've just given those, but rather to give a vote of thanks. Thank you so much, Ineke.
Thank you, Tawanda. No, you said what I wanted to say. Just a big thanks again to everyone for joining us today for this important discussion, and for all the speakers for really giving us some insights on the issues from different angles. I think that made the dialogue very engaging. And then just before we say happy festive season to everyone, we do still have a dialogue next week, Wednesday, on the Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Act. So please do join us for that if you can. And just a last thank you to the Rosa Luxembourg Foundation. I think that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.